Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and today we have a brand new Papo figure to take a look at. It's one of a very few amount of new 2021 prehistoric models for this year. There's just really been very little from Papo and no dinosaurs at all, which is just a travesty if you ask me. But we did get this Megalodon, and at first I was actually really quite let down. I thought the promotional images did not look very good, and overall it kind of looked like a bad figure. However, when it came into stock on Everything Dinosaur, my curiosity got the best of me and I placed an order for it. And, on top of curiosity, there's always that will to try to complete the Papo line as far as prehistoric releases go, so there's that as well. But honestly, here in hand, I will say the figure is actually a lot nicer than I expected it to be. It's, again, nowhere near as nice as some other Megalodon figures that are out on the market, like Collect Day or PNSO, but it really is still a pretty decent looking figure, and Papo has done an alright job on it. Again, it's not picture perfect, but it's also not near as bad as I was kind of thinking it was going to be, and I definitely am a little more happy with it now, having it here in hand and actually having a few moments to take a look at it. It's definitely a little bit nicer than I was expecting. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight to a closer look right now. So starting up here at the head sculpt of our Megalodon, you can see that it is positioned with the mouth open, looking really fierce, kind of what you would expect as far as like a stagnant pose for a Megalodon, as there is no area of articulation on this. We don't have an articulated jaw or anything like that, which, can be a good thing. And in this case, I kind of feel like it is, because often when you have articulated jaws on Megalodon figures, they just don't look as great as they do without the articulated jaws. We don't have any kind of weird seam lines or anything for the articulated jaw, so I'm actually okay with the mouth being open like this, and again showing off that very fierce look to our Megalodon. You can see that as far as the detail goes, of course it's a Papo figure, so it's going to be really highly detailed, and there is a lot going on as far as the detail here of the head sculpt of the Megalodon, specifically right here. I love how you can see all these wrinkles as the jaw is opening, kind of wrinkling the skin right there. So quite nicely showing off the movement of that mouth opening as wide as it is. You can of course see the inside of the mouth is painted really quite nicely with a pinkish coloration, and then we have the teeth painted. Some of the teeth are a little bit sloppy, but for the most part they actually look pretty good. It's again not quite what I would expect from Papo, as their quality used to be a lot better, but it's still by no means bad. And I think the overall visual of what we have here with the shark looks really cool. You can see that there is a gloss coat on the inside of the mouth, and on top of that pinkish coloration we also have what appears to be kind of like a reddish wash or a dark wash of some kind in there. Yeah, it looks like a really dark red, and you can see it's pretty abundant on the entire inside of the mouth of the Megalodon, and even the inside of the mouth does sport some really nice detail, and you can really pick up on that gloss coat again as we kind of turn this and shine it in the light. It shows up quite nicely on the inside of the mouth. You can also pick out the nostrils up here as well as the eyes. The eyes are painted really quite nicely. They have kind of a nice light gray color to them and a big black pupil as well as a black outline, and those as well are very nicely glossed. Now, one thing that I will say that I actually do really quite like about this particular Megalodon over some others is the fact that there is just a ton of like scars and stuff throughout the course of this figure. You can see them everywhere. It is just absolutely littered with what appear to be, injuries and stuff throughout the course of the shark. And you can see that it doesn't just, stop here in the face. It runs the entire course of the body. You can see them up here on the dorsal fin. They're even out there on the tail fin. So it creates a lot of like imperfections to the sculpt, and that, in my opinion, is a potentially very realistic aspect to this animal. And I feel like that really could have been potentially something you would see on Megalodon, and I do really quite like that, especially because it also just kind of differentiates it from so many others that don't have that. The coloration is also quite nicely done, as we have a nice white coloration here in the face that transitions to a really nice gray, but as we move back into the course of the body, you start to see other variations of grays picking up, so it's not just one solid tone of gray and then one solid tone of white. There are some variations of color included, which also helps to add to the realism of the figure. You can also see when we get nice and close that the actual texturing to the skin of the Megalodon is really quite nicely done. There is definitely some beautiful texture as we kind of let the light hit it, you can pick up on just how nice that actually looks. As you move back a little further, you can see the gills picking up, and those as well look really quite nice. Decent looking paintwork there, and really quite nicely done sculpt work. You can also see a lot of movement here in the jaw, as well as just generally like the head with the mouth opening the way it is. It really shows that off quite nicely there throughout the sculpt. As you move down here into the fin, again, you can see some varying colors as far as like the lighter and darker grays. We kind of have like a dark gray that outlines the fin, but we have a light gray on the inside, and you can see more of those imperfections within that fin. Again, lots of kind of like slices and injuries and stuff that have occurred to the Megalodon over time. The underside of that area also looks really, really well done. And then if you come back up here into the side of the stomach, again, you see more of those injuries throughout. We have just tons of them. And we also lead back here into this fin. And this is the only area, I think, of the paintwork that I really am not a big fan of, because you have kind of like a nice white fin, and then we have like a gray that kind of picks up and runs out to the tip of the fin. And that paintwork there looks honestly pretty bad. Like, it doesn't really look like body color. It looks just like a splotch of paint on that fin, so I'm not a big fan of that. I feel like that is really quite sloppy and certainly not up to par for what I usually would get from Papo. Once you move away from that area, though, the rest of the paintwork looks pretty decent. The dorsal fin up here is bent. I don't know if this is supposed to be bent or if it's just warped from shipment. I'm not entirely sure, but it certainly is bent on mine. You can see that the dorsal fin again is very nicely sculpted, again showing lots of imperfections, but also some variation of color, just like we saw on the fin. On the front of the shark, you could see a light gray as well as a darker gray up there. And then as you move back a little bit further throughout, you can again see more of the fins showing lots and lots of imperfections. So a lot of really cool realism added to the Megalodon, and you can also see how super smooth and lifelike the transitioning between colors is as we move down through the course of the shark. You can see it's super smooth everywhere aside from that fin right there. And then leading out into the tail fin, again, just tons and tons of imperfections and scars and stuff throughout, but you also see some more of that light gray and then the darker gray there out at the tip of the tail. It looks really quite nice. And then if we turn to the other side, we're not going to see too much difference probably over here, because again, the shark isn't in any type of a crazy dramatic pose. It does have a slight turn. As you can see, the body is turning toward the right, but it's not anything super dramatic or anything that's going to cause a large amount of difference on this side compared to the previous side. You can see again though that the head sculpt looks great over here. The eye paint is beautifully done, very precise with no sloppiness at all. We have more scars and injuries again throughout the entire course of this shark. You could see even a slice here that has occurred, quite a few slices actually, through the gills of our shark. There's just injuries everywhere as you run down through the entire body of this shark. Even almost looks like claw marks or something right here on the side of the stomach, but you can again see how we have that light gray and then the dark gray down here on this fin, just like we had seen on the previous side. And again, you see some more of that light gray kind of leading up here into the stomach, some more up here on the top of the dorsal fin. And then we get to this fin back here, which was the problem on the opposing side. It's also the problem on this side because it looks sloppy on both sides. Pretty darn ugly looking paint right there. But again, once we move past that, the coloration turns back to looking really quite nice and natural overall, and it's definitely a very nice looking figure. You can see a really big wound out here on the end of the tail on this side, but it's actually, again, a lot nicer than I expected it to be. You have a really nice appearance to the underside, nice and smooth looking with a nice bright white coloration, but even though it's definitely not the best Megalodon out there, it is quite a bit better than I was expecting it to be. As far as a size goes, for a length from the tail to the snout, you are looking at about 8 inches, almost on the dot, or about 20.5 centimeters. Now, of course, there's not going to be much for a height. You're looking at about a little closing in on 2.25 inches, or about 5.5, closing in on 6 centimeters to the tip of the snout, and then to the tip of the tail about 2.5 inches or 6.5 centimeters. So it's not that large. Being a Megalodon, you would expect it to be pretty big, but the Papo figures usually aren't all that big to begin with. I mean, they have some decent size at times, like Mr. Papo Rex does, who we are going to bring in for a size comparison right now. along with the Attack Pack Colovosaurus and Robert Muldoon, and you can see again what I was saying, how the Megalodon really doesn't have a very large size and could easily be misidentified as just being a great white shark, because there's nothing, in my opinion, that's overly impressive about the figure that's going to scream Megalodon. And one of the things that you would expect to have that aspect would be a larger size, and we don't really have that with this version. It's not, again, small, but it's also not quite as large as I probably would have expected. But at the same time, it is a pretty nice convenient size, so it's not something that's going to take up too much room in your collection, with still remaining really quite nicely sculpted and painted overall. And then for a second comparison, here is the Collect Day Megalodon in comparison to the Papo one, and you can see a very dramatic size difference between the two, but at the same time, I think they both look pretty cool. I would prefer the Collect Day version over the Papo version, but it's not really like the Papo version is bad. It's just kind of boring, I would say, in comparison to the Megalodon over here on the right from Collect Day, which in my opinion just looks a little bit nicer. It has a nicer paint application, nicer overall appearance, and a bigger size, whereas the Papo one really has decent paint apps, but it's just not as flashy or as appealing looking as the Collect Day version. And then for a final size comparison, here are the two PNSO Megalodon figures in comparison to the Papo Megalodon. And yet again, just like with the Collect Day version, I feel like both PNSO versions are just far more appealing. There's just a lot more realism to them, and I feel like they look more model-like as opposed to almost toy-like with the Papo version. Again, not saying that the Papo version is bad, because it's still okay. I would say it's a decent version of a Megalodon, but yet again, it has a pretty small size. I will say, though, that it is a little bigger than the newer offering from PNSO. As you can see, we get up here, it's just a tad bigger. Actually, maybe if the PNSO version had its tail straight out, they would be a similar length, so they're not too far off. If you happen to have the PNSO version, then they might actually be kind of cool to display together, but the large vinyl version from PNSO obviously just obliterates the smaller Papo version. So this Papo Megalodon is an okay figure, and I think one of the biggest problems with this figure is that one, it has kind of a boring paint application. Like every other one of the Megalodon figures that I just compared it to has a much nicer looking paint application that just looks more realistic, whereas this one just kind of has like a really light gray with some variation of darker grays and a white underside with, again, a little bit of lighter grays in between, but it's not anything that's like overly dramatic as far as a tone difference. Like they're all fairly light colors for the most part, with some very slight hints of darker grays here and there. But due to the coloration all looking so similar, it doesn't really stand out when it comes to a paint aspect. And on top of that, I just feel like the sculpt overall, although really cool looking, isn't as nice as any of the other Megalodon that we had just taken a look at. The one thing that I will say, though, is that I do really quite like the mouth of this version. Like, I think the mouth of this Megalodon is better than the mouth of the more recent PNSO Megalodon. It just looks a little more appealing to me, but the overall appearance of the rest of the body of the more recent PNSO Megalodon I feel like is nicer than this Papo version. The one thing that I do like on this Papo version, though, is I like that there's so many injuries and scars and stuff throughout, which the majority of the other figures I had just shared also have that, but this one is just obliterated. Like, there are so many scars and everything all throughout the course of this Megalodon. It is just littered with them everywhere. The paintwork, as far as like the eyes and the inside of the mouth and stuff goes, that's really quite nice, but the figure overall, I feel like, does still kind of fall flat. It is better than I expected it to be, but it's still not anything that I would say you absolutely need to buy. It's not something that you have to run out and pick up right now because it's a must-have Papo figure. And the sad part is that it was released on a year where we were already let down by not having any dinosaurs. So like if they had released maybe like an unbelievable Megalodon to make up for the fact that we didn't really have very many prehistoric releases from Papo, maybe it wouldn't be looked at so poorly, but at the same time, we didn't get that. Like, people really could have gotten behind a really nice Megalodon figure, but they released a lackluster Megalodon on a year with very little of anything. So as a whole, I would say that the Papo fan base is probably pretty let down with this year from Papo. And although this Megalodon, again, does look a little nicer than I expected it to be, it is by no means a great Megalodon, and certainly not something that you just need to own. However, if you are interested in picking it up, I will say again that it is better than I expected, so maybe it'll be better than you expect as well. So I will include a link in the description to where I purchased mine on everythingdinosaur.com, one of the best websites online to purchase dinosaurs, so make sure you check the link in the description and go buy this very interesting Megalodon from Papo if you are interested, and make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.